This is the second part of a tutorial to make a Python game that uses the mouse and vector drawing. In the first part we used our pre-game setup code to create a screen and some colours that we would use, and also a clock to keep track of time. We then created our game loop. The game loop deals with events. It has no game logic yet, but it then attempts to draw a chessboard and a player. At the moment, this is a call to a function that doesn't yet exist, so we're going to use the time now to create that function. So you can see here that we need to define this code above the game loop, so done equals false while not done here. Has to go above that. I'm going to put it below the definition of our clock, and we're going to have two sections of code. So I'm returning to my replit, which is looking like this at the moment. You can see here the undefined draw chessboard and the undefined draw player. So I'm going to come here above my game loop, and I'm going to say def draw chess board. So exactly the same spelling as I had before, and a colon to make a starting block of code. Now to draw a chessboard is made up of checkers, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start out and I'm going to say that shade equals grey, and that's one of the colours that we defined in our pre-setup code. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a loop for rows and a loop for columns. So for rows in range 8, and that'll go 0 to 7 with the range command. And then I'm going to do for columns in range 8 2. So I'm going to use nested loops here to make a bunch of rows that have got a bunch of columns in them. Okay, I need to find out where to place the actual squares. So I'm going to define sx, so that's square x, and sy at the same time. I could do them separately, but it just helps me to think about them as in terms of coordinates here. So that's going to be rows times square size and columns times square size. So it starts at 0 and then it goes to, let's say we had a chessboard of 400 divided by 8, so there'll be 50 each. So it's going to start out at 0, then go 50, then go 100, 150, 200 and so on. So that's exactly what we're looking for. Okay, so we now want to draw some rectangles on the screen. So that's going to be pygame.draw.rect. And the rectangle is going to take a bunch of information: a surface, a colour, a rectangle, and some extra things that we'll not worry about here. So where am I going to draw it? I'm going to draw it on the screen. Okay, what colour am I going to draw it? I'm going to draw it the shade. Now, I could just have put grey in there, but I need to change it as I go so that it makes a checkerboard. So I'm going to use a variable there instead of an actual colour. And then I'm going to put a square bracket in to supply this 4 bits of information. It needs the coordinates, that's sx and sy, and then it needs the size, and that's going to be square size, and it's obviously a square, so square size again. Okay, now that's not going to make me a checkerboard, so what I need to do is to flip-flop it between white and grey. So I'm going to say if the shade matches to grey, so if I've started out with grey, I'll do 1 square, but then I want to change it. So if it's grey, then shade becomes white. But what if it was white already, because I've already swapped it? Well, my else is going to say, well, if it wasn't grey, it must be white, so I'm going to switch it back to grey. So shade equals grey. So essentially what happens is every time this loop runs through, it will swap between grey and white. And that's it. That's my chessboard drawing code. So I also need to have a function for the player. So back to the side of the screen, and then def draw player. And draw player, we were supplying it with some x and y coordinates. So I'm going to call them play x and play y. Because this is a function, I need to put in my colon, and then the code goes inside here. And just as a placeholder, until we've got better code, I'm going to use just an ellipse. So I'm going to say PyGame.draw ellipse this time. Oops. And again, it wants a surface, a colour, and a rectangle. You might think it's strange that a rectangle is used for an ellipse, but it's the border around it. It's the shape that holds it. So it's going to be the screen, and I'm going to use red for the player, and then I need to give it the coordinates. So play x, comma, play y, and then the size is just the same as the size of the chessboard squares. So square size, comma, square size. Okay, so I've now got my drawing code. It's no longer complaining about not having undefined functions. So I'm going to run that and see what I get. You can see that my PyGame window has opened up. I've got some stripes, a grey, white stripe, and when I move my mouse around, this red circle is following. It's drawing from the corner of where my pointer is. That's sort of okay, but I've got stripes rather than checkers at the moment, so I need to do a little bit of an improvement to the code. So if we come back here and look, we had this code here, but what we need to do is to also swap as we go across the columns to do grey to white. So it's the same kind of code, but for each row as well as for each column. So I could actually just take this code here. I can copy it. I can go in between the rows and the columns, and I can paste that in. And you see it's just messed up the indentation here, so I need to have that else matching up with my if there. And if I try running that now, I'm hoping, there we go, we've got a checkerboard, the player is the exact same size as one of the squares, and we've got a nice checky pattern. So far so good. Let's go and look at the next option then. So we need to draw some pawns. Okay, so I'm going to create a draw pawn section of code below draw player, and I'm going to make an empty list of pawns and also do something about tracking how long it's been since a pawn's been created. So I'm going to call this pawn tick and start it at 0. I'm just going to put them just below my done equals false, so just before the while loop. That's the first thing I'm going to do here. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to say my list of pawns equals an empty list. So an empty list is square brackets. And I'm going to say pawn tick starts at 0. We've got no time at the start of the game. Okay, so I'm also going to create some code that's going to draw my pawns. Now I'm going to start out and just do a little bit of a pawn's head. So def draw pawns, colon because this is a new function, and then that'll indent there. Okay, so you can see that I've got some very specific chunks of square size being used, and this was a process of trial and error to get the right amounts. But I'm just going to give it a little bit of a go here. So I'm going to leave some space because I know I'm going to add some extra code. So I'm going to say PyGame.draw ellipse. So I'm going to draw the pawn's head. Where would I want to draw the pawn's head at? Well, I need to draw it on the screen. I'm going to draw it in black. And I then need to give it my coordinates. So I'm going to put it at pawn x plus, and then a quarter of the square size. So square size times 0.25. Okay. Now I realise actually I've got my pawn x here. I haven't actually included that. So each pawn needs to know where it is because I'm going to draw them all over the board. So just as we did with the player, I'm going to put pawn x and pawn y as the coordinates that I feed to this. So far I've got an x coordinate. I also need to have a y coordinate. So I'm going to put in pawn y plus, and then just a little bit down from the top of a pawn. So I'm going to say square size times 0.1. So I'm moving in a quarter before I start to draw the pawn, but quite high up. I need two more coordinates, and that's going to be the height and the width. I can come down, because I'm inside these square brackets, I can come down to the next line. So I'm going to put in there square size times 0.5, so it's half of a square wide and half of a square high as well. Square size times 0.5. Okay, so I've got my pawn ready to draw, and what I need to do now is to go and add some code. So I don't have the full thing yet, but I'm going to put into this game logic bit here something that keeps track of my pawns. So pawn tick equals pawn tick plus 1, so I'm ticking up the time, and this bit here says if when I divide by 25 I get no remainder, then I add a new pawn at a random position on the board. So I'm just going to quickly stick that in. So that goes down to my game logic section. I need to tab into the same level as my for loop there. And I'm going to say pawn tick equals pawn tick plus 1. So count forward a little bit. If pawn tick %25, so that's an integer division, and if it gives equals 0, if it gives no remainder, then pawns, so this is my empty list of pawns at the moment, pawns.append, so add a pawn on. Append is a function, so it takes round brackets, and then I'm just going to give it some coordinates. So I'm going to give it a square bracket, and I want to do random.randint 0 to 7, so that's the coordinates of the board, but so that it actually goes to the right place, I'm going to multiply by square size. And then obviously it's the same kind of thing for the rows and columns, so I'm going to take that bit, copy it there. One set of coordinates inside square brackets, there inside the round bit, so that it gets added. And the last thing I'm going to need to do is to actually draw each pawn in place. So I'm going to come back to my code here, and I'm going to say for pawn in pawns, and then I want to draw pawn and it's